Leon Matthews had always dreamed of living by the ocean. After spending years working as a marine biologist for an international research organization, constantly moving between different coastal regions and remote islands, he finally decided it was time to settle down. He needed a place where he could enjoy the tranquility of the sea, focus on his writing, and perhaps reconnect with a simpler way of living. That's how he found the beach cottage, a small, charming property perched on a quiet stretch of coastline, surrounded by dunes and tall seagrass. It wasn't part of the residential developments further inland, which suited him perfectly. Leon wasn't interested in neighborhood committees or rules dictated by homeowners associations. He wanted independence, privacy, and the ability to live on his own terms. The cottage was modest but well built, with wide wooden decks overlooking the shore and large windows that filled the rooms with natural light. From the moment Leon saw it, he knew it was the perfect place. It wasn't just a house, it was an escape, a place where he could be left alone to write, explore, and watch the tides roll in without interruption. He had paid for the property outright, using a significant portion of his savings from years of hard work. It was a commitment, but one he made gladly, knowing that peace of mind was worth every penny. At first, life at the cottage was idyllic. The mornings were peaceful, filled with the sound of waves crashing gently against the shore. Leon would wake up early, make a pot of coffee, and step out onto the deck, letting the salty breeze clear his mind before settling down at his desk to work. Evenings were spent walking along the beach or reading by the fire. It was exactly the kind of life he had imagined when he decided to buy the property. He rarely saw his nearest neighbors, who lived in a more developed area a few miles away. Occasionally he would wave at fishermen passing by or exchange a brief greeting with hikers who wandered down the beach trail, but for the most part he was left undisturbed. However, after a few months, Leon began noticing something odd. His utility bills, particularly his electricity bill, were unusually high. Given his simple lifestyle and limited use of appliances, the numbers didn't make sense. He wasn't running any large equipment, nor did he have any energy-intensive systems installed. The cottage was small, and he mostly used electricity for lighting, cooking, and his laptop. The bill seemed disproportionate to his actual consumption. At first he brushed it off, thinking it might have been an error on the part of the utility company. He decided to monitor his usage more closely for the next billing cycle. By the next month, however, things had only gotten worse. The electricity bill was even higher than before, despite the fact that Leon had made a conscious effort to use less energy. He started turning off lights whenever he left a room, unplugging devices when they weren't in use, and limiting the use of heating and cooling systems. None of it seemed to make a difference. The bill continued to rise, and Leon was starting to grow concerned. Something wasn't adding up. Curious and a bit frustrated, Leon decided to inspect the property himself. He checked the wiring around the cottage and examined the outdoor meter that measured his power usage. Everything looked normal at first glance, but Leon couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He wasn't an electrician, but he knew enough about basic wiring to spot anything obviously out of place. That's when he noticed a thin, inconspicuous cable running from the back of his meter box and disappearing into the tall grass behind the cottage. It wasn't something he had installed, and he couldn't recall ever seeing it before. The cable looked relatively new, with no signs of wear or weathering. Leon crouched down for a closer look. The cable wasn't just lying on the ground, it was carefully buried, with only a few inches visible above the surface. Whoever had placed it there had gone to great lengths to keep it hidden. His curiosity quickly turned to suspicion. Why would someone secretly tap into his power supply, and where did the cable lead? He followed its path through the grass, his pulse quickening with every step. The cable wound its way toward the more developed part of the coast, where a cluster of modern homes sat overlooking the ocean. These homes were part of a private residential development, one that Leon had deliberately avoided when choosing where to live. He stopped at the edge of the development, where the cable disappeared beneath a paved road. Leon stood there for a moment, weighing his options. He knew he couldn't just walk up to the houses and start asking questions without proof. Whoever had done this clearly didn't want to be found out. He decided to head back to the cottage and think things through before taking any further action. That night, as he sat by the fire, Leon's mind raced with possibilities. Was it possible that one of the nearby homeowners had tapped into his power supply to cut their own costs? It seemed absurd, but given how high his bills had become, it was the only explanation that made sense. He thought about calling the utility company to report the issue, but something held him back. Without concrete evidence, he wasn't sure they would take his complaint seriously. He needed to be certain before making any accusations. Over the next few days, Leon continued to monitor the cable. He checked it each morning to see if anything had changed, but it remained in place, as hidden as before. He considered cutting it, but a nagging voice in his head warned him against it. Whoever had set this up clearly wasn't afraid of bending the rules, and he didn't want to escalate things without a plan. Leon's peaceful life by the ocean was starting to feel less like a retreat and more like a battleground. The isolation he had once cherished now made him feel vulnerable. He had come here to escape complications, but instead he found himself entangled in a situation he didn't fully understand. One thing was clear: if he didn't act soon, the problem wasn't going to go away on its own. Leon couldn't stop thinking about the cable. The more he tried to brush it off as some misunderstanding or minor technical issue, the more his instincts told him that something wasn't right. He didn't like feeling watched or manipulated, especially in his own home, the one place he had hoped would be free from unnecessary interference. Over the years, Leon had dealt with plenty of pressure during his time in marine research, from political red tape to corporate interests trying to steer environmental studies in their favor. He thought those days were behind him when he left the fieldwork. But now, in this quiet coastal town, something new was starting to brew, and he didn't like where it was heading. Determined to get to the bottom of things, Leon decided to bring in someone who knew more about electrical work than he did. He called Joe, a local electrician he had hired before to do some minor repairs when he first moved in. Joe was a no-nonsense kind of guy, quiet, dependable, and good at what he did. When Leon explained the situation over the phone, Joe sounded concerned but didn't jump to any conclusions. Could be something innocent, could be something shady, Joe had said in his usual gruff tone. "I'll come by and take a look." The next morning, Joe arrived in his old pickup truck, toolbox in hand. They greeted each other briefly before Leon led him around the side of the house to the meter box and pointed out the cable. Joe squatted down, ran a hand along the length of the exposed section, and gave a low whistle. "This isn't standard," he said, pulling out a small flashlight to examine it more closely. "Looks like someone went out of their way to keep this hidden. See how it's buried just below the surface. If you hadn't been looking for it, you probably wouldn't have noticed it at all." Leon crossed his arms, his jaw tightening as Joe continued his inspection. Any idea where it might lead? Joe stood up, dusting off his hands. "Hard to say without digging it up, but it's definitely going in the direction of those newer houses over there." He nodded toward the line of modern homes in the residential development down the coast. "If I had to guess, I'd say someone's tapping into your power supply to run something on their end. Could be anything: extra lighting, heating, who knows." Leon felt a surge of frustration. So, someone's stealing my electricity, basically. Joe gave a small shrug. "Pretty much. And judging by how neatly this is done, they probably know what they're doing. This isn't some amateur job. Whoever set this up either knows electrical work or hired someone who does." Leon's first instinct was to cut the cable right then and there, but Joe quickly advised against it. "Look, if you just cut it, whoever's on the other end is going to know you found it, and they'll probably either come back to fix it or try something else. If you want to deal with this properly, you'll need to gather proof. Call the utility company, report the unauthorized connection, and have them send someone out to inspect it officially. That way you have a record of the incident." Leon knew Joe was right, but the thought of waiting for the utility company to handle things left a bad taste in his mouth. He hated the idea of someone tampering with his property and getting away with it in the meantime. Still, he didn't want to escalate the situation without a plan. Reluctantly, he agreed to follow Joe's advice. "Fine, I'll call them. But if they don't take this seriously, I'm not just going to sit around and do nothing." Joe nodded approvingly. "That's fair. In the meantime, I'll help you keep an eye on things. If anything changes, let me know. After Joe left, Leon immediately contacted the utility company. He explained the situation in detail, emphasizing that there appeared to be an unauthorized connection running from his meter toward a neighboring property. The customer service representative sounded polite but indifferent, assuring him that they would send a technician out to investigate within the next few days. It wasn't exactly the sense of urgency Leon had hoped for, but at least it was a start. Over the next 2 days, Leon kept a close watch on the cable and his property. He avoided making any drastic moves, sticking to Joe's advice to wait for the utility company's inspection. However, on the third morning, something changed. When Leon went out to check the cable as usual, he found that it had been altered. The section of the cable that had previously been exposed was now completely buried, with no visible trace remaining above ground. It was as if someone had come during the night and carefully concealed it, making it harder to detect. Leon felt a chill run down his spine. Whoever was behind this clearly knew they had been discovered and was taking steps to cover their tracks. This wasn't just a random act of theft, it was deliberate, calculated, and possibly part of something bigger. He immediately called the utility company again, demanding that they send someone out as soon as possible. This time his frustration seemed to get through, and they promised to dispatch a technician later that day. True to their word, a technician arrived in the early afternoon. Leon led him to the meter box and explained everything that had happened so far. The technician, a middle-aged man named Mark, listened carefully, occasionally nodding as he examined the setup. "You were right to call us," Mark said after a few minutes of inspection. "This is definitely an unauthorized connection. I'll file a report and forward it to the appropriate department. They'll likely open an investigation, but it might take some time before you hear anything back." Leon's patience was wearing thin. In the meantime, what am I supposed to do? Whoever's doing this clearly knows they've been found out, and now they're trying to hide it. How do I know they won't just keep doing it or find another way to mess with my property? Mark hesitated, clearly not wanting to overstep his role. "Look, my job is to document what I see and report it. I can't tell you what to do beyond that. But if you feel like your property is at risk, you might want to consider additional security measures, cameras, motion detectors, things like that. It's not a perfect solution, but it might help deter whoever's behind this." Leon thanked Mark for his help, though he felt far from satisfied. He appreciated the technician's honesty, but it didn't do much to ease his growing sense of unease. This wasn't just about electricity anymore, it was about control. Someone was trying to encroach on his space, his home, and he wasn't going to let it slide. That night, Leon sat alone on his deck, staring out at the dark ocean. The waves crashed rhythmically against the shore, a constant, familiar sound that usually brought him comfort. But tonight, it did little to calm his nerves. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Whoever was behind the cable wasn't going to stop just because they had been caught once. They were going to keep pushing, keep testing his boundaries, until they got what they wanted, or until he found a way to stop them. For now, all Leon could do was wait and prepare. If they came back, he would be ready. The following evening, after the technician's visit, Leon found himself pacing the length of his cottage. The utility company's response, while helpful on paper, hadn't brought any real sense of resolution. The cable was still out there, buried and hidden, and whoever had set it up hadn't made another move yet. But Leon knew better than to assume they'd just stop. Whoever was behind this wasn't just stealing electricity, they were calculated, precise, and determined. If they had gone through the trouble of hiding the cable after realizing it had been noticed, it was clear they weren't afraid of being caught. More likely, they thought they could outlast him, wear down his patience until he either gave up or moved away. Leon wasn't planning to do either. Still, he wasn't the type to act impulsively. As much as he hated waiting, he knew that charging in without a clear plan would only make things worse. He needed more information. He needed to figure out exactly who was behind this and what their endgame was. But at the same time, he couldn't risk exposing himself to further threats. The thought of escalating the conflict unnerved him, but doing nothing wasn't an option. That night, Leon decided to take a closer look at the area where the cable had disappeared beneath the road, leading toward the residential development. He waited until it was well after dark, when the streets were quiet and the homes in the distance were mostly dark. Carrying a small flashlight and a collapsible spade, he walked down the path toward where he had last seen the cable emerge before it crossed under the road. The night air was cool, and the sound of the ocean waves in the distance was faint but steady, a reminder of the isolated beauty that had drawn him to this place in the first place. When he reached the spot, he crouched down and used the flashlight to carefully scan the ground. At first it seemed like whoever had hidden the cable had done a thorough job. The surface appeared undisturbed, as though nothing had ever been buried there. But as he moved the flashlight along the edge of the road, something caught his eye, a faint line of disturbed soil running parallel to the road. It was subtle, almost invisible, unless you knew exactly what to look for. But it was there. Leon dug gently with the spade, careful not to damage anything beneath the surface. After a few minutes, he hit something solid, plastic tubing, likely used to protect the cable from the elements. Leon followed the tubing for a short distance until it curved and disappeared beneath the paved road. That was as far as he could go without drawing unwanted attention. He knew that digging up the road itself would be too obvious, and whoever was responsible would notice immediately. Frustrated but not discouraged, he carefully covered the area he had disturbed and stood up, brushing the dirt from his hands. At least now he had proof that the connection wasn't just random, it was deliberate, planned, and extended beyond his property. He made a mental note to document everything in detail once he returned to the cottage. As he began walking back, Leon noticed something that made him pause. A single porch light from one of the houses in the residential development flickered on and off a few times before going dark again. It was a small, seemingly insignificant detail, but it stood out to him. The house in question was near where the cable seemed to be headed. Was it possible that the flickering light was connected to the power theft? Leon couldn't be sure, but it gave him something to think about. He needed to figure out who lived in that house, and whether they might have something to do with the unauthorized connection. By the time he got back to the cottage, it was well past midnight, but Leon didn't feel tired. If anything, he felt more alert than ever. He sat down at his desk and began writing down everything he had observed, from the location of the cable to the flickering porch light. He knew that if this situation ended up in a legal dispute, he would need a detailed record of everything that had happened. The next morning, Leon decided to take Joe's advice and invest in some basic security measures. He drove into town and picked up a few motion-activated floodlights and a set of wireless cameras. He wasn't expecting the cameras to catch much. Whoever was doing this was clearly careful, but he figured it couldn't hurt to have an extra layer of security. By midday, he had installed the lights and cameras around the perimeter of the cottage, making sure they were positioned in such a way that they covered the most likely points of entry without being too obvious. Feeling slightly more secure, Leon decided to take a break and go for a walk along the beach. He hadn't had much time to enjoy the scenery lately, and he figured a little fresh air might help clear his head. As he walked along the shore, he couldn't help but feel a sense of frustration. This wasn't how he had imagined life at the beach cottage. He had come here to find peace, to escape from the chaos of city life and the pressures of his previous job. Instead, he found himself caught in the middle of a conflict he hadn't asked for. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. He turned to see an older man walking toward him, carrying a fishing rod and a small tackle box. The man gave him a friendly nod as he drew closer. "Morning," the man said, his voice carrying easily over the sound of the waves. "Haven't seen you around here before. You must be the new guy who bought the old cottage up the way." Leon returned the nod, noting the man's weathered face and easy demeanor. "Yeah, that's me. Name's Leon." "Bill," the man said, offering a hand. "Been fishing these waters for years. Nice place you got up there. Quiet, peaceful, most of the time anyway." Leon couldn't help but smile at the remark, though it felt slightly hollow. "Yeah, it's been good. Though I've had a bit of an issue lately. Seems someone's decided to tap into my power supply without asking." Bill raised an eyebrow. "That right? Sounds like something those folks up in the new development might pull. Always looking to cut corners, those types. Don't much like dealing with outsiders either." Leon's interest peaked. You know anything about them? Bill shrugged. Only what I've heard. They moved in a few years back, started building up that fancy little community of theirs. Big houses, big egos. They keep to themselves mostly, but every now and then you hear things. Complaints about folks who don't want to play by their rules, that sort of thing. Leon thanked Bill for the information, though it didn't give him much to go on. Still, it confirmed what he had already suspected. This wasn't just about electricity. It was about control. The people in the residential development didn't like the fact that he wasn't part of their little community, and they were trying to force him out. Whether it was to expand their property or simply because they didn't want an outsider living nearby, Leon didn't know. But he was starting to get a clearer picture of what he was up against. That night, as he reviewed the footage from the cameras he had installed, Leon noticed something unusual. Around 2 in the morning, one of the cameras captured a brief flash of light near the edge of his property. It was too far away to make out any details, but it was enough to confirm that someone had been there. They hadn't come close enough to trigger the motion-activated lights, but they had definitely been watching. Leon leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. This wasn't just about stealing electricity anymore. It was personal, and whoever was behind it wasn't going to back down without a fight. Leon woke the next morning feeling more determined than ever. The previous night's discovery that someone had been lurking near his property left no doubt in his mind. This was no random theft. It was deliberate, coordinated, and part of a larger plan to intimidate him. Whoever was behind it wasn't content with simply siphoning off his electricity. They were watching, waiting for something. But what? Leon didn't know yet, and that uncertainty gnawed at him. He was tired of playing defense. It was time to change tactics. He spent the early hours of the morning reviewing the footage from his cameras again, frame by frame. The flash of light had appeared only briefly, but as he paused the recording at the right moment, he caught a clearer glimpse of the figure. Though they were partially obscured by the shadows of the surrounding trees, one detail stood out. They were holding what appeared to be a handheld device, possibly a flashlight or something more sophisticated like a thermal camera. The realization sent a chill down Leon's spine. If this was simply about stealing power, why would someone need to be this careful or use specialized equipment? No, this was about more than electricity. He was certain of it now. After documenting the footage and making a few notes, Leon decided to follow up on the conversation he'd had with Bill the day before. The old fisherman had hinted that there were tensions between the residents of the new development and those who lived outside it. Maybe Bill knew more than he was letting on, or maybe he could point Leon towards someone who did. Either way, it was worth a shot. Leon grabbed his keys and headed into town. The coastal town, with its narrow streets and small shops, had always seemed quiet and welcoming. But today, something felt different. As Leon parked his truck near the marina and stepped out, he noticed a few people glancing in his direction, their expressions guarded. Word of his situation must have spread. Small towns were like that, news traveled fast, and everyone had their own version of the story. Leon ignored the looks and made his way to the dock where Bill usually fished. Sure enough, he found the old man sitting on a crate, untangling a fishing net. "Morning," Bill, Leon said as he approached. Bill looked up, squinting against the sun. "Morning, Leon. You look like a man on a mission." "You could say that." "I wanted to ask you something. Yesterday, you mentioned that the folks in that development don't like outsiders. What did you mean by that?" Bill set the net aside and leaned back, chewing on a piece of gum thoughtfully. "It's not just that they don't like outsiders, they want control. When that development went up, there were plenty of locals who weren't happy about it. Some of us have been here for generations, you know. Then these city folks come in, build their fancy houses, and start acting like they own the whole coastline." Leon nodded, urging him to continue. "Did anyone try to fight back?" "Yeah, a few did," Bill said, his tone turning serious. "There was this one guy, Rob Harrison. Owned a small plot of land right on the edge of where they built the first few houses. He didn't want to sell, but they kept pushing him, offered him money. Then started making his life difficult when he wouldn't budge. Lights from their houses shining into his windows at night, noise complaints filed against him for no reason, that kind of thing." "What happened to him?" Bill's expression darkened. He gave up eventually, sold the place and moved inland. Said it wasn't worth the trouble anymore. After that, they pretty much had free rein to expand as they pleased. Leon felt a spark of anger flare up. The story sounded all too familiar. It wasn't hard to imagine the same thing happening to him first, the power theft, then the intimidation, and if that didn't work, more direct forms of harassment. They were testing him, trying to see how much pressure he could take before he broke. But Leon wasn't planning on giving up like Rob Harrison had. He thanked Bill for the information and promised to keep him updated. On his way back to the cottage, Leon's mind raced with possibilities. If the development had a history of pressuring landowners, then there was likely a pattern, a series of incidents, each designed to force people out and expand their control. He needed more than just Bill's story, though. He needed hard evidence, something he could take to the authorities if it came to that. That afternoon, Leon reached out to his lawyer, Sarah Green. He explained everything that had happened so far, from the unexplained spike in his electricity bill to the buried cable, the technician's findings, and now Bill's story about Rob Harrison. Sarah listened intently, asking a few clarifying questions before offering her advice. Leon, this isn't just about electricity anymore. It sounds like a coordinated effort to push you out, probably because they want your land. If what Bill said is true and there's a pattern of this kind of behavior, then we might be looking at something much bigger, possibly even criminal. But we need proof. Without it, all we have is speculation. Leon had expected as much, but hearing it out loud made the weight of the situation feel even heavier. What kind of proof do we need? Start by gathering everything you can: documents, photos, video footage, anything that shows what's been happening. I'll see if I can dig up any public records on the development and its history. If there are any formal complaints or lawsuits filed by previous owners, that could help build a case. Leon agreed, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. It was time to go on the offensive. He spent the rest of the day documenting every detail he could think of. He photographed the area where the cable had been buried, recorded the footage from his cameras, and compiled his notes on the rising utility bills. He even started drafting a formal complaint to the utility company, demanding that they take further action to investigate the unauthorized connection. As the sun began to set, Leon took a break and stepped out onto the deck. The air was cool and salty, and the sky was painted in shades of orange and pink. For a brief moment he allowed himself to relax, letting the sound of the waves calm his nerves. This was why he had moved here, for moments like this. He wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. Just as he was about to head back inside, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah. Found something interesting. Call me when you can. Leon didn't waste any time. He dialed her number, and she picked up after the first ring. Hey Leon, so I did some digging, and it turns out that the development company behind those houses has been involved in a few legal disputes over the years. Most of them were settled quietly, but one case stood out. A couple sued them a few years ago, claiming they were forced to sell their property under duress. Unfortunately, the case was dismissed due to lack of evidence. Leon frowned. Lack of evidence. Yeah, it looks like the couple didn't have enough proof to support their claims. Without hard evidence, the court had no choice but to throw it out. Leon's grip tightened on the phone, so they got away with it. For now, yes. But if we can find something they missed, something concrete, we might be able to reopen the case, or at least bring some attention to what's happening. If nothing else, it'll put pressure on them and show that you're not going to back down easily. Leon thanked her again and ended the call. He felt a mix of frustration and determination. The people behind this development clearly weren't afraid to play dirty, but they had made one mistake: they underestimated him. They thought he was just another outsider who would fold under pressure. They were wrong. That night, as Leon reviewed his notes once more, he made a silent promise to himself. He wasn't going to be pushed out. This was his home, his sanctuary, and he would fight for it no matter what it took. As the days passed, Leon noticed that the tension around him was steadily escalating. It wasn't just the lingering presence of the hidden cable or the unnerving fact that someone had been lurking near his property in the dead of night. It was the way the atmosphere seemed to thicken with unease. The neighbors he occasionally saw on his walks along the beach no longer waved or smiled at him. Some of them even turned away as he passed, pretending not to notice him at all. Others gave him sharp, suspicious looks, as though he were the one causing trouble. It became increasingly clear that word of his conflict with the nearby development had spread, and the locals, whether out of fear or misplaced loyalty, wanted nothing to do with him. Leon didn't let it show, but the isolation was beginning to get to him. He had come here to find peace and solitude, but this was something different. He wasn't just alone, he was being actively shut out, treated like an unwelcome outsider by the very community he had hoped to join. Still, he wasn't about to give in. He reminded himself that he wasn't here to make friends. He was here because he loved the ocean, loved the quiet rhythm of life by the shore, and because this cottage was his, bought and paid for. No amount of social pressure was going to change that. But things didn't stop at cold stares and whispered gossip. A few nights later, just as Leon was finishing dinner, he heard a loud, metallic clang from outside. He rushed to the front porch, heart racing, and scanned the darkened yard. At first, everything seemed normal, just the quiet hum of the night and the faint sound of waves crashing in the distance. Then he noticed that his mailbox had been knocked over, bent at an awkward angle as though someone had driven straight into it. The tire marks in the dirt nearby suggested that whoever had done it hadn't even bothered to stop. Leon's first reaction was anger. He knew this wasn't some random accident, it was a message. Someone was trying to intimidate him, to make him feel unsafe in his own home. But anger quickly gave way to something more controlled, more focused. If they wanted him to feel scared, they were going to be disappointed. He wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Instead, he took photos of the damage, made a note of the tire marks, and went back inside to write everything down. Sarah had been clear the key to building a case was documenting everything, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. The next morning, he reported the incident to the local police. As expected, they didn't seem particularly interested. The officer who took his statement listened politely, nodded in all the right places, and promised to keep an eye out, but Leon could tell that nothing was going to come of it. He didn't blame them, really. In a small town like this, with limited resources and plenty of other things to worry about, a knocked-over mailbox wasn't exactly high on their list of priorities. Still, it was another reminder that he was on his own. If he wanted to protect himself and his property, he would have to do it without relying on anyone else. That afternoon, he went into town and bought a new mailbox, this time, a sturdier one made of reinforced steel. If they tried to knock it over again, they were in for a surprise. He also picked up a few more security cameras, this time with better night vision and motion detection capabilities. As he drove back to the cottage, he noticed something strange. A black SUV was parked on the side of the road, just a few hundred yards from his property. The windows were heavily tinted, making it impossible to see who was inside. Leon slowed down as he passed, trying to get a better look, but the vehicle didn't move. It just sat there, silent and ominous. He felt a flicker of unease but forced himself to stay calm. Maybe it was nothing, just someone pulled over to take a call or check their GPS. Or maybe it was something more. Later that evening, as he reviewed the footage from his newly installed cameras, he saw the SUV again. It had driven slowly past his cottage around sunset, pausing briefly near the driveway before continuing down the road. There was nothing overtly threatening about it, no one had gotten out, and there hadn't been any obvious signs of tampering or surveillance, but the timing was suspicious, and Leon didn't believe in coincidences. The following day, Sarah called with an update. She had managed to find more information about the development company behind the nearby residential community. As it turned out, they had a history of aggressive tactics when it came to acquiring land. Several years ago, they had been involved in a similar dispute in another coastal town a few hours north. According to Sarah, the pattern was always the same. They would target a property they wanted, start applying pressure through unofficial channels, things like noise complaints, minor acts of vandalism, and social ostracism, and then offer a generous buyout once the owner started feeling overwhelmed. "Leon, I don't want to alarm you, but you need to be careful," Sarah said, her voice serious. "These people know what they're doing. They've been through this before, and they're not afraid to play dirty. If they think you're going to put up a fight, they'll only escalate things. Leon appreciated her concern, but he wasn't about to back down. I get it, Sarah. But this is my home. I'm not going to let them push me out. I know, she said, sighing. Just document everything and don't do anything rash. If things get worse, we'll have enough to file for a restraining order or even press charges. In the meantime, I'll keep digging. That night, Leon decided to take another walk along the beach, hoping to clear his head. The air was cool, and the sky was clear, filled with stars. For a while, he let himself relax, focusing on the sound of the waves and the feeling of sand beneath his feet. But as he turned to head back to the cottage, he noticed something strange, a faint glow coming from the direction of the development. It wasn't the usual warm light of porch lamps or windows. This was different, colder, more focused, like the beam of a high-powered flashlight. Curious, Leon crept closer, staying low to the ground and using the dunes as cover. As he got nearer, he saw two figures standing near the edge of the development, shining their lights toward his property. They weren't doing anything overtly threatening, but their presence was unsettling. Were they scouting the area? Looking for something? Leon didn't know, but he wasn't about to confront them without a plan. Instead, he quietly retreated back to his cottage and made a note of the incident. He didn't sleep much that night, his mind racing with possibilities. Whoever these people were, they weren't going to stop. They wanted his land, and they were willing to go to great lengths to get it. But Leon wasn't going to make it easy for them. If they wanted a fight, they were about to get one. Leon woke up the next morning to the persistent sound of his phone buzzing on the nightstand. His heart sank as he read Sarah's message, "We have a problem. Call me ASAP." He immediately dialed her number, already bracing himself for bad news. "Leon, things have escalated," Sarah said without any preamble. "I just got word that the development company has officially filed a complaint against you with the local council. They're claiming you've been interfering with their infrastructure and disrupting public utilities. They're trying to paint you as the aggressor." Leon clenched his jaw. Interfering with their infrastructure? That's ridiculous. I'm the one whose property they've been messing with. "I know," Sarah said, her tone calm but urgent. "But they're playing a smart game. They want to shift the narrative and make it look like you're the troublemaker. If they succeed, they can use this as leverage to force you into a settlement or worse. Initiate legal action to take control of your property under the guise of resolving a public nuisance. You need to stay ahead of this." Leon's frustration boiled over. It was a classic tactic: twist the facts, apply pressure, and force him into a corner. He had seen similar strategies during his years working in environmental disputes, where powerful corporations would use bureaucracy and legal loopholes to silence opposition. He wasn't about to let that happen here. "What's our move?" he asked, his voice steady despite the tension building inside him. "We need hard evidence that they've been tampering with your property," Sarah replied. "The footage from your cameras is a good start, but we need something more direct, something that proves their intent to force you out. If we can show that they've been targeting you deliberately, it'll undermine their entire case." Leon knew she was right. He also knew that waiting for more incidents to happen wasn't a viable option anymore. He needed to take action, calculated, smart action, before they could tighten the noose any further. That evening, he decided to inspect the area near the development again, this time with a clearer objective: find something, anything that could expose their true motives. Armed with a flashlight, a sturdy pair of gloves, and a small backpack, Leon made his way down the beach as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was cool, the sky tinged with deep purples and oranges, but Leon's focus was entirely on the task ahead. As he approached the line where his property ended and the developments began, he noticed something new: a freshly installed utility box, partially hidden by a row of hedges, stood near the edge of the road. It hadn't been there before. He crept closer, careful to stay out of sight, and examined it. The box was unmarked, which struck him as odd. Typically, utility boxes bore the logo of the company that maintained them. Leon crouched down and carefully opened the panel with a screwdriver from his backpack. Inside, he found what he had suspected: a secondary cable running from the box, spliced into the main line. It wasn't connected to any official grid, it was tapping directly into the existing infrastructure, likely drawing power from his line without authorization. This was the proof he needed. He quickly snapped several photos of the setup, making sure to capture every detail, including the splice connection and the direction the cable ran toward the residential development. Satisfied that he had enough evidence, Leon carefully closed the panel and started making his way back to the cottage. But as he turned to leave, he froze. The beam of a flashlight swept across the dunes, heading in his direction. Someone was coming. He ducked behind a cluster of rocks, heart pounding as he tried to stay hidden. The footsteps grew louder, crunching against the sand and gravel. "See anything?" a voice called out, low and tense. "Nothing," yet another voice replied. "But if he's been snooping around, we'll know soon enough." Leon stayed perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. Whoever these people were, they weren't just random security guards. They were looking for him specifically. He waited, muscles tense, as the flashlights continued to sweep the area. After what felt like an eternity, the men finally moved on, their voices fading into the distance. Once he was sure they were gone, Leon slipped out from his hiding spot and hurried back toward the cottage. By the time he reached the safety of his home, his mind was racing. They knew he had been investigating. This wasn't just a simple land dispute anymore. It was a high-stakes game, and they were willing to go to great lengths to win. He immediately sent the photos he had taken to Sarah, along with a detailed explanation of what he had found. Within minutes, she called him back. "This is exactly what we needed," Sarah said, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and urgency. "This proves that they've been illegally tapping into your power supply. Combined with the footage from your cameras and the pattern of harassment, we have enough to not only file a counter-complaint but potentially launch a criminal investigation into their activities." Leon felt a surge of satisfaction. For the first time in days, he felt like he had the upper hand. But he knew better than to let his guard down. "What's our next step?" "I'll contact the local council first thing in the morning and submit everything we have," Sarah said. "In the meantime, you should be prepared for pushback. They're not going to take this lying down. If they've gone this far to cover their tracks, they won't hesitate to escalate things even further." Leon nodded, though Sarah couldn't see him. "Let them try. I'm not backing down." That night, as he locked up the cottage and double-checked his security system, Leon couldn't shake the feeling that the real fight was just beginning. He had the evidence he needed, but he also knew that exposing the development's illegal actions would only make them more desperate. They had a lot to lose, and desperate people often did dangerous things. Still, he was ready. This was his home, his sanctuary, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it from him. If they wanted a war, they'd get one, but on his terms. The next morning, Leon was up early, his mind already racing with what needed to be done. Sarah had promised to handle the legal side, but he knew that exposing the development company's illegal actions wasn't going to stop them immediately. People like this didn't give up just because they got caught. If anything, they were likely to double down, using their influence and resources to delay or undermine any investigation. Leon wasn't naive. This fight was far from over. By mid-morning, Sarah called with an update. "I submitted the evidence to the local council and the utility company. It's only a matter of time before they're forced to respond. In the meantime, I've also contacted a local journalist I trust. She's interested in covering the story, especially with the proof we have." Leon hesitated. He wasn't keen on the idea of bringing in the media. It would draw more attention, and with that came more risks. But Sarah was right. Public pressure could be a powerful tool, one that might force the council and law enforcement to act more quickly. "All right," he agreed reluctantly, "but keep it controlled. I don't want this turning into a circus." "Understood," Sarah said. "You did the hard part, Leon. Now it's about making sure the right people see what's really going on." Later that afternoon, as Leon sat on his deck, he noticed something unusual. The black SUV he had seen before was parked farther down the road, but this time it didn't move. He watched it for a while, expecting it to leave after a few minutes, but it stayed put. Whoever was inside wasn't hiding their presence anymore. They wanted him to know they were watching. It was a blatant intimidation tactic, and it only made Leon more resolute. Deciding he wasn't going to be intimidated, Leon walked down his driveway, stopping just short of the SUV. He stared at the tinted windows, waiting to see if anyone would react. When nothing happened, he pulled out his phone and deliberately took a photo of the vehicle. After a few moments, the engine roared to life and the SUV sped off down the road. Leon didn't flinch. They wanted a reaction, but he wasn't going to give them what they wanted. That night, he received a call from Sarah. Good news. The utility company confirmed that the cable was unauthorized, and they've officially opened an investigation. The council's also reviewing the complaint, and with the media now involved, they'll have a harder time ignoring it. Leon allowed himself a brief moment of relief. It felt like progress, but he knew better than to celebrate just yet. And the development company. They've gone quiet, which means they're probably scrambling to figure out their next move. Don't be surprised if they try to offer you a settlement to make this go away. Leon snorted. I'm not interested in their money. I figured as much. Just be careful, Leon. They know they're backed into a corner, and that makes them dangerous. The following day, things took a surprising turn. A representative from the development company showed up unannounced at Leon's cottage. It was a middle-aged man in a sharp suit, carrying a briefcase and wearing the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He introduced himself as David Carter, the company's legal advisor. Mr. Matthews, I'm here to discuss a resolution to this unfortunate misunderstanding. Carter began smoothly. Our company values good relationships with the community, and we'd like to offer you a generous compensation package in exchange for withdrawing your complaint. Leon didn't bother inviting him in. Not interested. Carter's smile didn't waver, but Leon could see a flicker of frustration in his eyes. I understand you're upset, but there's no need for this to become more complicated than it already is. A legal battle would be costly for everyone involved, and this offer would allow us to put the matter behind us quickly. Leon crossed his arms, his expression cold. You mean it would allow you to cover up what you've been doing? I'm not withdrawing anything. If you want to resolve this, tell your people to stop harassing me and start cleaning up their mess. Carter's smile finally faded. You're making a mistake. No, you made the mistake when you decided to mess with my property. Now, unless you have something useful to say, get off my land. Carter didn't argue further. He gave Leon a curt nod, turned on his heel, and walked back to his car. As Leon watched him drive away, he knew this wasn't the last he'd see of them. But he also knew he had made his position clear. They weren't going to bully him into submission. Over the next week, the investigation gained traction. With the media covering the story and public interest growing, the council and utility company had no choice but to take decisive action. The development company, facing mounting pressure and the threat of legal action, eventually agreed to remove the unauthorized cable and issue a formal apology. It wasn't the complete victory Leon had hoped for, but it was enough to end the immediate conflict. In the end, Leon decided to stay. He had fought hard for his cottage, and he wasn't about to give it up now. The threats and intimidation might have shaken him, but they hadn't broken him. This was his home, and he had earned the right to live there in peace. If anyone tried to take that from him again, they'd find out just how far he was willing to go to protect it.